and basalts, maybe that's part of the story. If we go back a few lectures in this spring series, the supercontinent lecture, do you remember we had Old North America? We had a very sharp boundary where the edge of the basement rock of North America is located. Where was that? Well, we said it was Spokane, and sure enough, that old edge of Old North America, and what's on the other side of this line? A bunch of those exotic terrains that came in off of the ocean. Is it a coincidence that this deepest river canyon is basically right on that old boundary? There's a more formal geology name for that section of the old boundary called the WIZ, the Western Idaho Shear Zone. So just think there's a there's a bunch of faults that are shifting a bunch of the bedrock north on the exotic terrain side. It's a shear zone where there's been northward movement. And basically I'm trying to say that there's some big faults in that area. Is there a connection between the WIZ, the Western Idaho Shear Zone, and the location of Hell's Canyon? I'm going quick, and you're like, well, what's the answer? Remember, I told you, all these are potential areas, but we're not going to lock into one of these. I'm going to lean towards one in just a bit. Is this an Ice Age story? Is there a bunch of meltwater coming off of the ice sheet? Well, we're too far south for that. The ice sheet is up here in northern Washington, etc., so that doesn't work. But some of you know there was a big Ice Age flood that came through Hell's Canyon. It's called the Bonneville Flood. The Bonneville Flood. And we have a good date for it. It's an Ice Age flood, not the Missoula. It wasn't Ice Age flood water that came from Montana. It's water that came from Utah, from Lake Bonneville. And there was a hell of a flood that got over Red Rock Pass, dropped into Pocatello, found the Snake River, and followed the Snake. And a major Ice Age flood, one big flood, came through Hell's Canyon 18,000 years ago. 18,000. So a fraction of 1 million years. So to say that Hell's Canyon is 3 million years and then to say this Bonneville flood is why Hell's Canyon is so deep is probably a stretch. In fact, we view Bonneville flood as more of a dumper than a cutter. There's huge piles of Idaho rocks that are sitting in the floor, especially in the floodplains of the Hell's Canyon floor. But it doesn't look like that's a major cutter. Finally, and those that have gone to other lectures know that I'm fond of this, uplift intensifies erosion. It's not that the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River, it's not that the Colorado River is so powerful, it's that northern Arizona is tectonically lifting. And that is an accurate way to view northern Arizona. That this canyon is here because starting 6 million years ago, northern Arizona starts to get a little closer to heaven every year, starts to tectonically uplift, and the Colorado River tries to hold its position. It aggressively cuts. And that's the general view for many of the river canyons in central Washington. The Yakima River south of Ellensburg, Washington, is a river being there first, tectonic uplift due to some folding. That's accurate. But I don't know if we can fall in love with this either, at least in the way that I've discussed uplift in the Pacific Northwest before. I'll do it quickly. Why is there uplift south of town? Right, there's clockwise rotation. The clockwise rotation we talked about last week. The clockwise rotation that keeps coming up in many discussions involving earthquake potential and everything else in the Pacific Northwest. These are arrows. I'm doing it very quickly. Basically, everybody's rotating around Pendleton, Oregon. This is something we've been able to document with instruments, GPS receivers. But northern Washington and British Columbia do not rotate. So we're rotating everybody into a fixed northern Washington, and as a result, we are squeezing central Washington and have been for many millions of years. What's the result? Big earthquakes on the Saddle Mountain Fault, the Menashtash Ridge Fault, the Umtanum Fault, the Toppenish Ridge Fault, the Seattle Fault, as well as forming the ridges that you drive over when you go to Yakima. That's all in response to that crustal rotation. So why aren't I hitting clockwise rotation hard for the formation of Hell's Canyon? Yes. Everybody is rotating around Pendleton, Oregon. Hell's Canyon is to the east of Pendleton. How is this rotation having anything to do with Hell's Canyon development? Now, it's clear we have the Blue Mountains and the Wallowa Mountains and the Seven Devils Mountains on either side of Hell's Canyon, and those have clearly been lifted. But I have not found the right person or the right scientific paper to for sure document why that uplift here is happening. And to me, that's an unsolved part of this story. I can't hold it because the energy is so great right now, so I'm just going to go for it. A pet idea that I have been thinking about, and it's come from a few little stray sentences in papers I've been reading and a few conversations with geologists, is this. Is there a regional tectonic uplift event that we don't know about or don't know very much about? Is it possible that many of the river canyons in the entire Pacific Northwest are energized simultaneously? What I'm saying is, instead of the uplift and the incision of the Snake River being from clockwise rotation, is there something more broad in Pacific Northwest land? About 6 million years ago and about 3 million years ago, coincident with these two numbers. Those numbers keep coming up, and I'll show you some visuals to kind of play with that idea. What I'm trying to say is, it's possible in the next 20 years, we may be able to build a case that the Yakima River and the Wenatchee River and the Palouse River and the Snake River, etc., the Chutes, etc., are all deciding to get aggressive at the same time at 3 million years ago and maybe also 6 million years ago because of an accelerated regional uplift. That's tantalizing for many of us. Nobody's had the ability to kind of put that together in one major message. Okay, I want to do one more thing with the chalkboard, and then we'll go to the visuals. Thank you so much for the energy. Let's erase this, and let's, believe it or not, use the supervolcano discussion we did last week. Like, how in the world would that have anything to do with what we're doing now? Well, the rest of the chalkboard is talking about the evidence we have for this number, 3. Where does that number come from? You just pull that number out of a hat? I said hat. I could, 3, 6, Where does that number come from? I mean, it's just younger than 16, but actually being specific about 3 and 6. What's the story there? Well, I'll make it as quick as I can. Yes, I will. I'll make it as quick as I can. So we know Hell's Canyon is here. And you remember my quick offhanded message that if you really want to figure out the age of a river canyon, you got to get out of the canyon. So if we go downstream of Hell's Canyon, we're suddenly at the Ringgold Formation. And if we go upstream of Hell's Canyon, we're in southern Idaho in some lake beds called Lake Idaho. So let's put 2 lakes on this map. Lakes that we know existed. Lake Idaho, Lake Ringgold. The Ringgold Formation are the deposits at the bottom of Lake Ringgold. There's a bunch of beds at the bottom of Lake Idaho. Let's draw those very quickly. There's about 1,000 feet of sedimentary layers making up the Ringgold Formation, and we'll just say Lake Idaho. There's a bunch of formal names, but let's not do it. We'll do this, Lake Ringgold. Now I got to be careful. Okay, so this is LR, and this is Lake Idaho. And you know what I need to do? I need to get this out of here. Because one of the big messages is when we have these 2 lakes, there is no Hell's Canyon. There is no Snake River coming through the area. Oh, really? Yes, if we go far back enough in time, we can go earlier than the lavas, we can go earlier than the cutting and realize there was a totally different geography. So these sedimentary beds of the Ringgold Formation go roughly between 8 and 3 million years. And the sedimentary beds for Lake Idaho go 8 to 3 million years. I'm going to change this. I'm going to put 2.8 up here at the top. 8 to 2.8, 8 to 2.8, okay? Now, I did a lecture 2 years ago called Ancient Rivers of the Pacific Northwest. Some of you were there for that. And we talked about the Columbia River moving around in response to the great lavas pushing the rivers around. And we used evidence like river cobbles and lava-filled valleys and things like that. Put the lecture out there on YouTube. A lot of people liked it. I got an email from a guy named Jerry Smith. He says, I'm Jerry Smith from University of Michigan. I enjoyed that lecture. But I think you could have used one more line of evidence to prove where rivers used to be. You can use fish fossils. I've spent the last 55 years studying tiny fish fossils in Lake Ringgold and Lake Idaho, and I can prove when Hell's Canyon started to form. In other words, when the Snake River used to show up on this map at 3 million years ago. So we'll do it quickly on the chalkboard, and we'll do it again with the visuals. Jerry Smith and others looking at fish fossils in these two sets of lake beds. You've got it now, right? We've got a lake here, and we've got a lake here. What are we seeing in those lakes? Between 8 and 3 million years, we have fishes that say Lake Ringgold was warm water and was isolated. Isolated from who? Isolated from the other lake. I'm no fish person. I know nothing about fish. I'll show you some pictures, but that's about it. But we'll take Jerry's word for it with the specialist that you can study fishes from this time and this time, same time, and there's no evidence of the fishes swimming between those two lakes. That's important to us tonight, isn't it? If you're not fishing, if you're not swimming between these two lakes, you got no river between the two lakes. But what happens at 3 million years ago? At 3 million years ago, between 3 and 2.8 million years ago, the same fish fossils are in both basins. And the fish thrive in cold water. And we have salmon now coming from the Pacific Ocean and getting into both of these places. In other words, we have warm fishes, separate warm fishes, no connection between the two, and then starting at 3 million years ago, we have the Snake River showing up, and not only showing up, but starting to dig to start our Hell's Canyon creation. So that kind of regional story can be told from these teeny tiny little fragments of little fishes, among other things. And that's where we've added Jerry Smith's work to some of this other stuff. Now, I promised the hotspot stuff and the supervolcano stuff. I got to do that real quick. And then I promise we're going to the visuals. Here's the last little part of this. If I pick 11.8 million years ago, who's got a good memory? Why is that date significant? The 11.8 million years ago from last week, that was the huge supervolcano explosion in southern Idaho. Does anybody remember it now? Right. It's right here. And ash from that Bruno Jar Bridge explosion 11.8 million years ago had 30 feet of ash fall out of the sky in central Washington. That was the Cougar Point Tuff that we discussed last week. Why in the world are we going to this now? The answer is, this is a cross-section now. This is a little picture here on the side. If you have Idaho, this is the sun. This is a person 11.8 million years ago. If you have Idaho sitting on top of a hotspot, that portion of Idaho is going to get heated up. It's a hotspot. beneath that portion of Idaho. What's going to happen to that portion of Idaho? It's going to be heated up and it's going to be expanded. We're going to have thermal expansion of that section of Idaho. We're going to have a temporary dome where the hot spot is located. Why is that important to us tonight? Well, if you have a temporary high, a topographic high, aren't you going to have rivers draining away from that temporary high? So that fits right into our story, because when we had the Yellowstone hotspot located here, we had a continental divide. Just like we today have a caldera and a continental divide at Yellowstone Park. That means 11.8 million years ago, we had rivers draining to the Atlantic Ocean east of the continental divide, and some rivers, according to Jerry Smith's fish work, going down the Sacramento River to Central California. And we sure as hell didn't have the Snake River coming through Hell's Canyon. We're starting to form the lake at 8 million years ago. So let's do this. Let's jump to 8 million years ago. Now the hotspot is at Twin Falls. We've moved the continental divide a little bit. We still have our lakes going this way. We still have the Columbia doing this. But we're going to start forming a small Lake Idaho and a small Lake Ringgold, and we're probably going to have some kind of little divide between those two lake basins. Let's jump ahead to 3. That's a magic number for us tonight, 3 million years ago. Now the hot spot is approaching Yellowstone Park. The continental divide has shifted again, and now our Lake Idaho has become very large. That's too large. It's become large. And Lake Ringgold has become large as well. So at 3 million years ago, we begin the incision of Hell's Canyon. Is it simply getting Lake Idaho too big to finally fill and spill over this divide and start forming Hell's Canyon? Or is it more of a tectonic story to eventually get rid of these lakes and to get our Snake River story and to get Hell's Canyon to begin? You can see there's lots of things going on with this, and it's difficult to have one person to have a grasp on all these different areas, with all these different specializations. But we're getting closer to figuring that out. I don't want you to leave, and here's one way to do it. In the last 5 minutes of our visuals, we're going to have a brand new scientist show up on the scene, Lydia Steisch, and she has new evidence from the Ringgold to suggest that maybe Hell's Canyon is older than 3 million years. Now, how could you leave after that kind of a teaser? Well, I think we need some visuals. I think we need some beautiful pictures, and I think we need a few maps that might help us a little bit. I think we need a little bit more fleshing out of some of those ideas. I know it went quickly. Thankfully, if you watch on YouTube, you've got a pause button. You can sit there and think about it for a while and then move on. But not here. I don't think there's a pause button on me or from your seats. So, Grand Canyon, how old? 6 million years old, saying the Colorado River started to dig that hole. Here's Grand Canyon from Google Maps. Here's Hell's Canyon from Google Maps. They look different, I'll grant you. I mean, beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. I don't know which one is more beautiful. That one's a national park, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And here's us in the Pacific Northwest. Ore-Ida. We did this on the chalkboard. There it is in living color. The age of the rock layers do not help us very specifically with the age of the canyons. More Google Maps from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And on the Idaho side, an amazing place with alpine lakes up at the Seven Devils Mountains. Have you been up there? It's an amazingly alpine scene, and yet you can drop all the way down the 8,000 feet down to the river. So I joined a field trip 3 years ago with Basil Tinkoff from the University of Wisconsin. I learned an amazing amount about that area. And here's the old road that we took from Whitebird, Idaho. We were camping near there, Hammer Grade, I think it was called, and then followed this old dusty gravel road from the east and got ourselves down to Pittsburgh Landing. So here's at least one stretch of Hell's Canyon. You may know very much more about more stretches. This is the main stretch that I know from geology trips. I saw this in Lewiston, Idaho last month. It's an amazing place, and of course part of the allure is how remote and how few people there are out there. Now, if you're willing to jump to this area for just a second, thank you for doing that, number one. This is the Yakima River Canyon just south of Ellensburg, and for more than 100 years, people have been looking at Beavertail Bend. And I'm happy to say Beavertail Bend still exists. This is just this past winter. Jesse Peters captured this beautiful shot. We had a very tough February, if you weren't with us here in central Washington. But he was out on a cold night capturing this. And a more classic shot from Tom Foster showing these amazing river meanders that have incised into the local basalt lava flows. What's the general message? Those flows used to be flat. They got folded. And as you fold those ridges, you form the canyon. And as I've been teaching for a long time now, it's the clockwise rotation of Northern California, Western Oregon, and Western Washington against the stationary Northern Washington and Canada that's responsible for the squeezing, uplift, and digging of the Yakima River to form the Yakima River Canyon. That's on a loop, obviously. But if we look at it more artistically, this is the Rosa area of the Yakima River Canyon. There's Burbank, and then Eaton's Ranch is up towards the top. Again, this is on a loop, and we can see that if the Yakima River Canyon is about 6 million years old, and it is, we've had this kind of gradual uplift, we think gradual uplift, over the last 6 million years for the Yakima River Canyon. But you heard one of my big points tonight. I don't see how that is the story at Hell's Canyon if we tie the uplift of Hell's Canyon and the uplift of the Wallowas and the Blue Mountains and the Seven Devils Mountains. I don't see how we can tie that to the clockwise rotation, mostly because of the location of Hell's Canyon being further east than most of that motion. I mean, these shots, amazing, by Hell's Canyon. This is the Grand Ronde River Canyon. You can see the same kind of amazing meanders that have incised. This is really tectonic geomorphology we're talking about tonight, trying to understand why rivers dig when they do. That's one aspect of it. And this is what I was trying to say with you all. Is there some sort of regional tectonic story involving uplift, involving some sort of change in the oceanic plates offshore that are most agree that the ocean plates are driving the clockwise rotation? So have we figured out the history of the Juan de Fuca Plate and the Pacific Plate at these two times in history to see if there's some sort of regional story that most of us are unaware of at the moment? I know this is very fuzzy, but Andy Miner, who's been a very helpful geologist with not only this lecture, but most that I've put together down here, he lives in Cle Elum. Andy sent me this. These are images, very sketchy images of sediments off the shore of Washington and Oregon. And the main thing to notice here is that there's a major unconformity. There's a major change between the folding of some of these older sediments and the layers that are above the red line are not folded at all. If you see this in geology, an unconformity represents some sort of tectonic event, some sort of uplift and erosion story. So even offshore, perhaps there's a record of this either 6 million or 3 million year change in the tectonic story. So this is the lecture that I did 2 years ago that I was talking about. And I'll summarize some of the main points from that. I focused on the Columbia River having this weird bend to it and wondered why it had a weird bend. And we decided in that lecture it was the great lavas that came out of these cracks that pushed the Columbia River west of Ellensburg for a time, pushed the Columbia River west of Goldendale for a time. And it's the lavas coming out of these deep fissures that's responsible for that. This is roughly 16 million years ago. You've seen this already. Floods of lava completely changing the river story and the topography of eastern Washington. And after most of those lava flows, we have this lifeless, featureless plain. If you get to the Grand Ronde River Canyon or other places where the rivers have dug more recently, you can see those layers stacked one on top of another. The German chocolate cake that's 3 miles thick in the middle of it near Tri-Cities. And the Columbia River has decided to leave where it was pushed, and at least south of Wenatchee, the Columbia River has decided to return to the central part of these great lavas. Why? Because the weight of those great lavas have depressed Washington, have depressed the crust below sea level. And water flows to the lowest spot. You heard it here first. Water flows downhill. Aren't you glad you came? So here's a map of where those great lavas are found. Here's the Snake River. This is a map of today, not in the past. Here's Ontario. You leave I-84 and Hell's Canyon up through near Riggins, etc., and the Salmon River coming in. So notice the Salmon River is coming into the Snake River today. And it's the Snake River that's coming up through southeastern Washington. Got it? That should look familiar to you. This is today. Well, let's go back a few million years. This is a familiar looking map in general, but notice this is the Salmon River 10 million years ago. And the Snake River is not in Washington at the time. And we know that was the Salmon River because of these river rocks, these red river rocks that came from the Seven Devils Mountains. This is the lecture a couple of years ago. I'm just reprising a few of these major points. So these beautiful spuds, these are actual river rocks, and these are potatoes from our kitchen. These actual river rocks are the size and shape of potatoes, and they tell a story of rivers changing their position. And if you have red river rocks, you have the old Salmon River coming into Washington at a particular time. This is up above Wallula Gap in Tri-Cities. The Salmon River coming through this area between 10 and 8 million years ago. Salmon River, you want more evidence that there was the salmon and not the snake, and therefore we don't have Hell's Canyon at this time? We have this famous place near Colotis where we have 3 different lava flows of 3 different ages that actually flowed down a river canyon, the Salmon River Canyon. So we have fossilized river valleys by lava flows filling those old valleys. The evidence is beautiful. And then, of course, there's the famous blonde quartzite river cobbles that tell the story of the old Columbia. If you find a bunch of blonde quartzites, you know that's the Columbia coming through your property at some time in the past, like this video clip. These are blonde, mostly blonde colored river rocks. In fact, some of these guys have been sitting next to each other for 8 million years until this morning. These are quartzites from the Rocky Mountains. The Columbia River brought these in. There can be no other way these rocks got here. So that was the emphasis of that lecture 2 years ago. The Columbia River, the Salmon River, and I purposely ignored the Snake and Hell's Canyon at the time because I didn't know any of that stuff. But I did have a few maps that I snuck in, and that's what caught the eye of the geologists that saw that lecture. And they said, hey, you've got the Snake River coming through this area during the time of the lava flows. I think you're missing the boat on that. You should talk to Jerry Smith about his fish fossils. And so that is kind of where I started this lecture about 1.5 years ago. What can I find out about the old Snake River system, Hell's Canyon, and Jerry Smith's work? So I taught a Geology 351 class last spring. Every Wednesday we went out from 1 o'clock until sunset. And we went to different places. And our theme for last spring was to go to as many places that had ringgold-like beds as possible to learn this story. So we started by going down to Granger where those big cobbles are located. And old Grandpa Carl here, Carl Hulbert, who's in the audience tonight from Granger, has been very generous with his time and his place to open it up for anybody who wants to come and learn about his place. His place is important. It's where the old clay pits are located. They used to have a brick factory down there. But it's the clay beds that were not my interest. It was the river cobbles. The river cobbles that helped tell the story of which river was here at which particular time. And the next few days, I came back with my Geology 351 students, and we said, well, we're just starting out. Why don't we head up here and take a look? I'm not even sure what we're looking at. I'm talking to my students now. Can we climb up there and make a few cross sections and try to figure out the variation in the rock layers here, which are sand and which are rivers? And I just assumed at the time it was the Ellensburg Formation that we were looking at. So you know that occasionally I post on Facebook, not my private stuff, but I like to use it for geology. And so I posted this after that trip, that night, after I took the vans back to Mortarpool, sitting in the van, posting on Facebook, and said, hey, had a good afternoon with my students out at the Ellensburg Formation near Granger. And Bruce Bjornstad, a geologist in Tri-Cities, said, I don't think that's Ellensburg Formation. I think that's Ringgold Formation. I don't know why you're calling it the Ellensburg Formation. And to most people, who cares? But to us, we do care, because if it's Ringgold, the source of the Ringgold sediment is coming from the Hells Canyon area, as opposed to calling it the Ellensburg Formation, which means those are things coming from the Cascades, which is a totally different story. So the Ringgold Formation is all this sediment that sits on top of the basalts. That's why I never really cared about the Ringgold before. I was interested in the basalt lavas. All that dirt sitting on top, I didn't care about. But now, if I realize that there's details in the Ringgold that help us understand the Hells Canyon, then I'm all in. So where can we go find the Ringgold? Well, we can go to this old town site of White Bluffs along the Columbia River. Here's a beautiful shot taken by Tom Foster. He's standing on top of Saddle Mountains looking south. So he's got the White Bluffs on the left, he's got Tri-Cities in the distance, and here are a couple of the reactors at Hanford on the right side of the photo. Now, there's Ice Age stuff out there at White Bluffs as well. Let's ignore that if we can, please. We just want to look at the Ringgold portion of White Bluffs. And there's an amazing flat top to this pile of 1,000 feet of Ringgold sedimentation, some of it below river level, actually. And suddenly we have respect for these layers, at least I do, because it's that Lake Ringgold that we were talking about that's part of this Hells Canyon story. But not the Hells Canyon yet, right? If we have Lake Ringgold and have these layers at the bottom of Lake Ringgold, we are pre-Snake River, pre-Hells Canyon creation. What can we find in these layers of Ringgold formation to help us with the development and the timing of Hells Canyon? Oh, a backpack. Oh, a van key and some interesting sedimentary structures. Again, I go to Facebook. I say, well, I take my students down to White Bluffs, and there's a guy from David Green from Wapato says, I used to collect fossils there at White Bluffs. And I'm like, you're kidding. What did you find? Where were you in the White Bluffs? Where in the Ringgold, in other words? He said, I found camel, sloth, horse, beaver, squirrel, giant Irish elk, rhino, mastodon, antelope, badger. They were all disarticulated. There's a specific layer that produced all of that vertebrate material. One layer in the 1,000 feet of Ringgold. Well, I went down and visited with David at his home. He showed me all his wonderful fossils that he had collected before the Hanford site became protected. And this is a camel bone pulled right out of one particular layer in the Ringgold. Here are some little vertebrae of something or other. I'm not much of a biologist, obviously. That turned me on to a report by a guy named Gustafson from University of Oregon, who looked at that vertebrate layer in the Ringgold. And this is the cover of it, bulletin number 23, the vertebrate faunas of the Pliocene Ringgold Formation. There's another mystery. If you're keeping track of mysteries, why are all these vertebrate fossils just in one horizon within this 1,000 feet of Ringgold? And why are all the bones screwed up? Why don't we have intact carcasses? So by taking that report and Bjornstad's unpublished work from the Hanford site and Newcomb in 1958 and Lindsay in 1996, I made this generalized stratigraphic column of 1,000 feet of Ringgold sitting on top of the Elephant Mountain basalt. And the main point for you is that there's hardly anything in the Ringgold Formation to get a date from. It's very difficult to figure out where we are in time. So that's another major challenge. If we can find some key grains in the Ringgold, which we're about to do with Lydia, we need to figure out when those grains were brought in. I'm a little ahead of myself, but I just wanted to keep us going here a little bit. Those red stars are the horizon where David and friends kept finding the fossils. So we brought a group of many of you guys out there last spring, and David was along. David's in the beard there, so he had a bunch of things to say to the group, and they really enjoyed that. It's always kind of fun after the trip. They said, I really enjoyed that fossil guy. Your stuff not so much, but that fossil guy I really enjoyed. And there's places you can get your hands dirty right there in the Ringgold along the White Bluffs. wonderful old mastodon molars, etc. Of course it's interesting stuff. It's very different from our normal routine in geology. Well, here's a little bit on Jerry Smith, the specialist with the fish fossils. I've had emails back and forth, but basically his first email to me back last spring was, fish have some utility to be a fourth line of Paleo River evidence because of their tight restriction to water. And that has proven to be true, that his work, his long career with these fish fossils have really helped us. So digging through these papers with all this biology is very difficult for a guy like me. But I kept reading through, kept emailing him. He was very patient with me, and I got at least the gist of his story. It turns out one of the exposures of the ringgold that has been good for him was not at White Bluffs, but closer to Othello on the north side of the Saddle Mountains. That's still ringgold there. So some of you may know, if we're up on top of the Saddle Mountains, it's ringgold formation at the very top. It's the same stuff as the White Bluffs. The White Bluffs are up there in the upper right. Can you see them? So those white layers continue to the summit of the Saddle Mountains. But here's the ringgold again right at Smyrna Bench, if you know Crab Creek there. There's a thick section of ringgold to study there. And there's some cows. And it's this spot that's been most helpful to the fish people, an exposure of the ringgold formation at a spot called Taunton. And you're like, I've never heard of that. Well, that's where the Milwaukee Railroad was put through, just to the west of Othello. You might know it now. It's just south of 26. And that has been a very convenient place to sample for all these tiny fish fossils. Why would you do that again? What's the whole point? You're trying to figure out the Snake River's history and the source of the material in those lakes, and the temperature of the water, and whether there's a connection to the ocean or not. Well, let's take a look at some of these fish fossils. This will be fun. There's Grandpa Carl. Let's go check this out. Well, there you go. There's a fish fossil for you. I mean, look at the scale on these things. These are from Jerry Smith's scientific papers. That's a millimeter. So talk about painstaking work to sift through all this sand and silt and find these little broken pieces of different fishes and try to figure out the conditions in Lake Ringgold and Lake Idaho, and realize there's different species in both of those lakes between 8 and 3 million years ago. This is amazing level of precision and detail that feeds into a regular regional story. Yeah, I know what that is. That's a fish head. Even in Nevada, there are some of these lake beds. So it's more than just a Snake River story. You can connect these old lake basins before there were through-going rivers through many of these intermontane areas. But here's the main point I was trying to drive home on the chalkboards. If it didn't work for you then, maybe it will work for you now. 1,000 feet of sediment in central Washington, 1,000 feet of sediment in southern Idaho, 2 different lakes, 2 different isolated lakes. This is a map from Lydia, who we'll talk about in just a second. No Snake River between them, no Hell's Canyon between them, and the evidence is we have fishes in this lake that are totally separate from different kinds of fishes in the other lake. Before 3 million years ago, the species, and I wish I could give you all the names, like sunfish and all these fishes that don't need cold water and don't need migration to the ocean, are thriving in those 2 separate lakes. But suddenly, between 3 million and 2.8 million years ago, things changed dramatically. The same fishes are in both beds. There's salmon coming from the ocean somehow, and the interpretation is it's the Snake River that's allowing that connection between these places. So it's time for some professional diagrams. 16 million years ago, we have a hot spot in northern Nevada. That red dashed line is the Continental Divide. We have green rivers flowing away from that Continental Divide. We've got the flood basalts coming out of those fissures. No Hell's Canyon, no Snake River. Moving on. 14 million. Why is the hot spot moving? Most of you know this. The hot spot is not moving. It's North America drifting to the southwest over the stationary hot spot. We still don't have our lakes. We still don't have the Snake River. But now we get these two, what look like hearts, Lake Ringgold in darker orange and Lake Idaho in lighter orange with a little divide in between the two. Remember now, between 8 and 3 million years ago, those are isolated basins. We continued to drift the hot spot, which means we changed the drainage patterns, changed the rivers. I mean, it's 4 million years ago. We still don't have much that looks familiar, do we? I'm going to hit one more click of the advancer here. You ready? Oh, yeah. It happened that, quote unquote, quickly. 3 million years ago, we capture the whole scene, and then by the time we get to today, we've got the Snake River coming from Jackson Lake in Jackson Hole and the Yellowstone area. Okay, we're almost done, but I have to be complete with this lecture. Here's the new kid on the block. She replaced Ray Wells, who worked for the USGS for 35 years. She is good, she is smart, she is young, and she is turning this story on its head. And that's healthy if you are willing to accept all the new information coming in, which most of us do. So here's the main message from Lydia Stice, work she's done just in the last 2 years, and it's ongoing work. Lydia says, look, I've been studying the Ringgold with my techniques, and I've got sand in the Ringgold that's 8 million years ago from the Snake River Plain in southern Idaho. Now let's pause and just check this out before we quit. What is she saying? She says she has sand grains that are clearly, according to her work, we'll look at her evidence, from the Snake River Plain. And those sand grains were brought to central Washington and dropped into Lake Ringgold 8 million years ago. Why are we pausing about that? Up until this point of the lecture, we've said that we don't have a Snake River coming through Hell's Canyon until 3 million years ago, right? This is the new exciting development that's stirring the pot a little bit. How is it possible, if those truly are grains of sand from the Snake River Plain, how did they get here? If not through Hell's Canyon, is there another option? So she got interested in the Ringgold by accident. Her first major project, newly hired, was to work on the Saddle Mountains Fault. She's based in Menlo Park, down in San Francisco, but it was decided she was going to work on the Saddle Mountains Fault and figure out what kind of seismic risk we have here at Beverly. And she's working with layers that are exposed on both sides of the fault, the Ringgold. So she did what she could to learn about the Ringgold, primarily to say something meaningful about the Saddle Mountains Fault, which crops out right above the Smyrna Bench and has been a very active fault in the past. Still unclear how worried we should be about the future, but it's an active fault. And she published on that Saddle Mountains Fault and got that out there and feel like everything was fine. But then she said, well, wait a minute. I started finding all this interesting stuff in the Ringgold. So I'm going to shift my focus, and that's where she is now. I want to learn more about this Ringgold because I'm finding stuff that doesn't belong here. It's too old for the conventional story of 3 million years. So she now has presentations like this: Ringgold Formation Sedimentology, Implications for the Ancestral Rivers of the Pacific Northwest, basically talking about Hell's Canyon development. So, turns out she came up to Ellensburg to give a talk right in the middle of when I was doing this 351 class. So that was convenient. And I said, well, you know, I've been out looking at this stuff. What have you learned, Lydia? And she says, well, I've been sampling zircons, these little very durable grains that are in the sands of the Ringgold, and she can get a lot of information out of those zircons. Details about not only the ages of the zircons, but the source of the zircons. Where did those sand grains come from? This is an exciting new technique that's been used. So you can find a certain zircon and trace it back to a particular watershed, someplace upriver where the sand grain was brought to. This is a powerful technique. Well, back to Grandpa Carl. I said, well, we got to go down and check out Grandpa Carl's place. He's got a bunch of sand that's in the Ringgold. And I was all set to bring her up to all those river cobbles. I figured she'd want to deal with that. And she said, no, I got what I need right here. She pulled out a Ziploc bag and just grabbed a bunch of sand. It's the sand in the Ringgold with the zircons in it what is meaningful to her. And it's what's going to unlock this new story if it does become a new story in the next few years. Lydia had a summer field assistant. Forget what her name was. Sorry about that. She had another field assistant. Very cute dog that's with her at all times. She operates in style. This is her teardrop trailer that she camps in. So she's got a lot going on, and the Pacific Northwest is her domain. So we did climb up through Carl's Layers, Grandpa Carl's Layers. This is, again, Snipes Mountain, south of Granger. And there's beautiful old blocks of petrified wood that have been tumbled through there. That's a whole other story. But later that day, Lydia gave a talk at Central. Some of you were there for that talk on her work with the Ringgold Formation and using these zircons to try to figure out the source of the sand. Now, these are difficult things to read, but she basically has been sampling sand in modern rivers across the Pacific Northwest. Here's the Yakima River, Okanagan River, Matau, etc. And she's got a particular signature from those grains and where those grains are coming from, and then she compares it with the zircon signals in the Ringgold and tries to compare Ringgold sands with modern river sands and make a statistical case that many of the sands that she has in the lower Ringgold are coming from the Snake River Plain. So she's making maps like this now with all these rivers, and here's our hotspot track and the supervolcanoes from last week. The Simcoe Volcanics near Goldendale are part of this, but poorly understood, at least by me at the moment. And here's a map of where she has sampled in green. She's been collecting more sand from Oregon in 2018. Other spots of different colors she sampled at different locations. So this is an ongoing project, and potentially, all I'm trying to say here is that our crucial understanding of the age and development of Hell's Canyon may be changed from the 3 million year date if she continues with this work and makes it agreeable to all. These are the last two maps. Lydia currently has a couple of models. This is not her final decision, but a couple of working models. Let's look at this. Is it possible to get sand from southern Idaho to Othello, let's say, in Washington, without using Hell's Canyon? You see what she's doing here? She's wondering if it's possible to have a salmon river route to get sand grains from the Snake River Plain, come up this, my old thesis area between the Beaver Heads and the Lemhi Range, and then continuing up into Lake Ringgold. That's a potential. So it could be that the 3 million year date is accurate for Hell's Canyon if this is borne out with the data. Or is it possible Hell's Canyon is much older than 3 million years? And we have our lake beds with limited circulation between the two lakes, but possibly can we get those sand grains to come through Hell's Canyon as early as 8 million years ago. If that's true, then Hell's Canyon is 8 million years ago at least. And we got a lot more time for the Snake River to dig and a lot more time for uplift, and it's a whole nother spin on the whole thing. So the Snake River, and in fact all the rivers of the Pacific Northwest, are telling a story not only of canyon development, but regional uplift across the whole region. And I love this shot from Lynn Weisenfels near Hell's Canyon in the Grand Ronde scene with the Columbia River basalts and our familiar looking rocks with this deep level of cutting by many of the rivers in the Pacific Northwest. I want to thank you all, not only for coming tonight, but for coming to all four of these lectures this particular month of beautiful April here in Ellensburg, Washington. Hey, we'll see you next year, okay? Thanks, everybody. Thank you much. So plant fossils of the Pacific Northwest, that is the topic. Are you aware that we could all go out into the parking lot right now, jump in our rigs, drive 45 minutes north, we could get up in the Wenatchee National Forest pretty easily on some logging roads and we could find plant fossils. Probably before it got dark tonight. They're all over the place in the bedrock north of town. You got to know where to go. You got to find the right logging road, the right Forest Service road. You got to find some sandstone and shale. And once we get to the right outcrop, we'd throw the truck into park. We'd get the 5-gallon buckets out of the back of the vehicle. We'd get the rock hammers and the sledges and the chisels and the screwdrivers and the paintbrushes and the everything. And we'd have a grand old time. And we would find hundreds and hundreds of fossilized leaves north of town. Leaves from palm trees. Palm leaves, the size of dinner plates. There's an unlimited supply of these things 45 minutes north of town. Let's say we had a great time and we did that tonight. And then we come back tomorrow night and we say, let's do that again. And we jump in our vehicles and we go the other way. Within 30 minutes, we could be in the Yakima Canyon or up Badger Pocket or 30 miles to the east of here and go to the town of Vantage. And this time we'd be in the desert. We wouldn't be up in the forest. We'd be out on the desert. Probably the wind would be howling, right? It's green this time of year. There'd be some sagebrush and some cheatgrass. And if we knew which layer to work with, and it's basalt lava rock this time, south of town, we would find impressive tree trunks in the basalt lava from long ago. And the most famous of those fossilized tree trunks, that petrified wood, are ginkgo trees. So my first question tonight are those palm trees north of town and those ginkgo trees south of town from the same forest? Is that the same time that we're talking about? Put that one on hold for just a second. One of the lectures we did last year in this series, I shared the excitement that we all had because somebody from the Burke Museum in Seattle found the first dinosaur bone ever found in Washington. They found it in San Juan Islands, a fragment of a left thigh bone of a T-Rex. First dinosaur bone ever found in Washington. We recorded that lecture, we put it on YouTube, and I started getting a bunch of comments last spring. And some of the comments were like, hey, I think you blew it on that dinosaur thing, because I live in Yakima, and they dug up a dinosaur like 25 years ago. Or I live in Granger. We got statues of dinosaurs all over the place. There's dinosaurs, we got them right here. And Moxie, and Sela, and Tri-Cities, in Seattle. They kept talking about all these dinosaurs being pulled out of the ground. So I replied to each comment, and I said, no, those were mammoths. And they come right back and go, I agree, those dinosaurs were really mammoth. They were really big. So there's confusion. There's confusion, I think, among many people. If they give it much thought, most of these fossils, plants and animals, are just from prehistoric times. And they're all kind of back there together. The palm trees and the ginkgo trees and the dinosaurs and the woolly mammoths, it's all just back there. Oh, hell, we'll throw in some cavemen for fun, right? It's just back there. So one of the main things I want to do tonight is make sure that when we talk about specific plant fossils, we know where we are in our geologic history. Each of those plant fossils or animal fossils are talking about a specific environment from the past. And plant fossils are famous for being very sensitive to conditions, to climate conditions. And if we change our fossils through time, we change our climate through time. So the plant fossils are important to study not just because they're cool, not just because we can throw them in the back of our truck and bring them in and put them in the front yard, but they are important for scientific study as well. So I've got a quick little timeline up here. I'm going to do this very quickly. These are in millions of years. This is a science lecture. 66 million years ago, most of us know that the dinosaurs of the world became extinct. There are no dinosaur bones worldwide in rocks that are younger than 66 million years ago. Not one dinosaur bone is younger than 66. So this is the famous extinction of the dinosaurs. And below that, we've got lots of dinosaurs around the world. That dinosaur bone on Sucia Island in the San Juans came out of some siltstone 80 million years old. Our plant fossils tonight here in the Pacific Northwest are all younger than the dinosaur time. Great. Now the mammoths, dinosaurs, mammoths, is there really a difference? Of course there is. The mammoths are an Ice Age creature. the woolly mammoths. And I can just pick the number 3 for simplicity, but during the Ice Age, the last 2.6 million years, we had these woolly mammoths dominating much of the world, including central Washington here. So I don't care really personally about the anatomical differences between dinosaurs and mammoths. I'm interested in the fact that they represent a difference of more than 60 million years worth of time. That's where I'm coming from. But this is not a lecture on this is not a lecture on animal fossils, it's a lecture on plant fossils. And there are lots of different plant fossils. I got tons of visuals for you tonight. Tons of video clips and beautiful pictures. And we're between these two times, younger than the dinosaurs, older than the mammoths. But I want to zero in on 2 key dates. A bunch of plant fossils from 56 million years ago. And those are our palms up at Blewett Pass. And the ginkgo trees out by Vantage, Yakima Canyon, Badger Pocket, those are roughly 16 million years ago. So they're not the same forest. They're separated by 40 million years. So we're going to do some things with these 2 time frames primarily, and then we'll dabble in a few other spots down in Oregon, northern Idaho, etc., between these 2 things. Okay? Let's keep it moving because I want to make sure we get to all these wonderful visuals. So I'm going to leave that on the blackboard. I'm not going to change it. That's our little reminder of our times that we're talking about. So, why palm trees? Why palm trees 56 million years ago? And to be fair, the Squak Formation has a range of ages, but a bunch of the palm fronds are coming from 56 million years ago. Well, we know that palm fronds and palm trees like hot and humid conditions. We're from central Washington. If we go on a spring break trip, we're going to take a bunch of pictures of palm trees to prove we're in a warm, beautiful place, like we made a good choice. Look at this. There's a palm tree, right? They're not here. I know Yakima is the Palm Springs of Washington, but there's no palm trees down there. Okay? So they're subtropical. Palm trees, palm meadows, they love subtropical conditions. Let's make it as simple as possible. And for our purposes tonight, let's just say we need hot and humid conditions. We need temperature hotter than current day in central Washington, and we sure as hell need a bunch more precipitation if we want to grow palm trees here north of Ellensburg. Well, I want to bust a couple of myths. I've been out with a lot of people through the years, and I keep hearing these 2 stories, kind of these folks that have all the answers, and both of these stories are wrong. There's a third one that actually is accurate and what we want to hit hard tonight. So, 1, 2, 3. Why was it hot and humid here 56 million years ago for these palm leaves and other things? There were big swamps recorded in these bedrock layers north of town. One talks about the Cascades, and in fact, mentioning that there was no Cascades at the time. And so far, so good. We know the Cascade Mountains, don't we? The Cascade volcanoes, right here. These are the Cascades. And if I draw a picture in side view of the Cascades, where this is east and this is west, and here's the Pacific Ocean offshore, we know about the rain shadow effect, don't we? And the idea is that we get a bunch of moisture in off the Pacific Ocean. Seattle gets a lot of rain. And over here in Ellensburg at the Morgan Auditorium, we don't get nearly as much rain. We get less than 10 inches of rain a year here in Ellensburg. That's because of the rain shadow effect. The fact that these air masses with moisture in them have to get up and over this barrier, the Cascades, and by the time those winds are over here, they've lost most of their moisture. So the idea is, we got palm leaves in central Washington? Well, those palms are from such a long time ago that the Cascade Mountains were not here. And a bunch of moisture could get all the way over to eastern Washington. That's true so far. The Cascades have a 40 million year history. The Cascades are younger than these palm fossils. So far I'm in. We are getting a